Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. We'll just wait maybe one more minute to make sure everyone is able to get into the Zoom room, and then we'll get started. Feel free to say hi in the chat, introduce yourself, where you're from, which community you're coming from. Thanks so much for joining. Let's get started. Hi, good afternoon. Oh, thanks for using the chat. Feel free to keep saying hi in the chat. Let us know where you're from. My name is Rabbi Hilly Haber. I'm the Director of Social Justice Organizing and Education at Central Synagogue, and I'm also one of the co-chairs, along with Matt Nosenchuk, of the New York Jewish Coalition on Criminal Justice Reform. And I'm joined today by the fantastic and wonderful Zachary Katz-Nelson. Zachary, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. So I'm Zachary, and I'm the executive director of something called the Lippman Commission. We have actually a much longer formal name, which is the Independent Commission on New York City Criminal Justice and Incarceration Reform. You can see why we just say the Lippman Commission. We're headed up by it's kind of a panel of a couple of dozen civic leaders from across New York City, people with experience directly in the criminal justice system, judges, former corrections commissioners, lawyers, people who are service providers, academics, people who've been incarcerated at Rikers, who were pulled together about 5 years ago and headed up by the former chief judge of the state of New York, Jonathan Lippman, thus the name Lippman Commission, pulled together about 5 years ago to study Rikers and to figure out what should be done with the jails here. Rikers is, by the way, a complex of 8 separate jails that are active right now. There are actually 10 jails on the island, but 8 of them that are active right now. It holds over 5,000 people, about 95% of whom are pre-trial. So people waiting for their day in court, and looked at Rikers and said, this is an unsustainable, irredeemable place. And I'll get into that a little bit more, and recommended that it be closed, and really helped galvanize the city's decision to close Rikers and to replace it with jails in the boroughs. There are some jails that exist in the boroughs now. Four of the 5 boroughs have jails right now. Some of them are very old, decrepit places. To build new jails on those sites that would be much more humane, much smaller than exists now, much fairer, and that we now push for the policy reforms that are necessary to bring us to a day where we can actually close Rikers.
Zachary, thank you for that. I'm wondering too, just paint a little bit more. You touched on this a little about, the kind of history and context of Rikers and who's there. What's the population size there right now? If you could tell us a little bit more about who might be there, how long they might stay there, how many officers work there, things like that.
Sure. So, and thank you again, everybody, for joining. Pause there. I don't think I said that before. So as I said, Rikers is really predominantly a pre-trial facility, people that have not yet been convicted. They're people that are charged with crimes. Most people who are here because bail was set in their case, but they're not able to afford it. Almost 90% of the people who are here are Black or Latinx. Almost half the people here have some form of mental illness. 17% of the people here have a serious mental illness. And just give you a sense of how that's changed over the years. And overall, there are about 5,500 people who are incarcerated in the jails here. There is one active jail on the jail barge that's moored to the Bronx that holds several hundred people. The rest of those 5,500 people are here at Rikers. Rikers is a place. There's one bridge in, one bridge out. There's one city bus that comes to Rikers, but there's no subway service. It's really an isolated place. It's right next to LaGuardia Airport. For those of you who haven't seen it or driven past it yourself, and it is a place that has been neglected for decades. Really, both the physical plant that's here and the people that work here, the people that are incarcerated here. It has been an area that really has been out of the public eye for a long time. That clearly has changed over the last few years, and particularly over the last several weeks, given the level of crisis that exists here now. But many of the buildings here were built 50, 60 years ago. Rikers itself is where New York City used to dump its garbage. So it's a 400+ acre island, but only about 75, 80 acres of that is actual bedrock. The rest of it is landfill, is garbage that New York City dumped here for a long time and then was covered over. And the jails, many of the jails are built on top of that. And so that garbage is still decomposing. It means that the ground shifts, that methane gas leaks up, that the pipes crack in the buildings, the foundations crack from time to time as the ground shifts. It really is a very toxic island, frankly. And there have been many correction officers have complained about higher rates of cancer for them and their colleagues. It is a place that is not fit for human habitation. And the buildings themselves, because they were neglected for so many years, are really crumbling. There's asbestos, there's mold in there. Toilets frequently back up. The sewage doesn't work properly, but also it's the number one source of weapons for people in jail is actually the buildings themselves. You can reach up and just break off a piece of a fan vent or a plexiglass here and craft it into a blade or a shank. And it adds to the level of violence in this place and the threat in this place that wouldn't happen in a facility that was properly built.
So as you said, I mean, the facilities there have been decrepit and not safe for years. But Rikers now is in the news cycle right now for several reasons. So I'm wondering if you can tell us, what's happening today on the island. Tell us a little about what we've been hearing in the news, and if you could fill out that picture.
Sure. So the threshold level of Rikers is this incredibly decrepit, neglected place, but also a place marked by violence, brutal violence. And there's been a federal court case that's been ongoing for a decade now about the level of violence here committed by officers against incarcerated people, but also the level of violence between incarcerated people is staggering as well. And that has been the case for many, many years. And it's just almost the culture, the norm here is that even the smallest hint of disrespect is met with force. And the Rikers is under a court order. The jails that are here, the 8 jails that are here, are under a federal court order to try and reduce the levels of violence. It actually hasn't succeeded so far. That was the kind of the threshold level that we were working from. Over the past several months, and many months leading, kind of starting with COVID, the onset of COVID, is that many officers here got sick, and several of them died from COVID. So did some incarcerated people. In those early days, the department did a really terrible job taking care of its people. Didn't provide personal protective equipment. It didn't provide for social distancing. People were forced to come back to work when they were still sick. And it really created a lot of bad blood. Over time, the population has really, population went down for quite a while in initial days of COVID, and then has gone back up to where it was before COVID. But many officers are not reporting to work. And what that means that many are calling in sick. Under the union contract that exists here, officers have unlimited sick leave. They can call in whenever they feel they need to. The level of violence, the stress that people are under has led people to choose that route oftentimes. Some people are legitimately sick. Some people just feel like they need a break. Some people are just like, I just don't want to be at work. And when there are fewer and fewer officers here, that means the officers that remain are being asked to work double and triple shifts. Each shift is 8 hours. So people are working 16 or 24 hours in a given day, oftentimes without any warning or notice. So, as a parent myself, I think to myself, what would it be if at the end of my workday, I'm told, no, you can't leave. You can't go pick up your kids. You can't be home to put them to bed. You can't see your loved ones. You're staying here. You may not have food. You may not have water with you. There's no officer to relieve you to go get anything. You can't even make a phone call home. And so that's happening more and more and more. And that means officers have even less reason to want to come to work, because that may be what's waiting for you, in addition to the violence, in addition to all the other problems. And so on any given day right now, 30% of the officers are not available to work with incarcerated people. Some of them have requested medically modified status, where they feel like for their medical conditions, they shouldn't be in contact with incarcerated people. Others are just simply not showing up to work at all. They're not even calling. And so if you have 30% less staff than you should, that means that there are areas of the jails where there are simply no officers at all. there should be an officer on the floor of every housing unit, every cell block or every dormitory where people are living. There's supposed to be officers, one kind of staffing the electronic controls that open gates and doors and watch video from inside what's called a bubble, inside behind plexiglass. And there's supposed to be at least one officer walking around on the floor with people, seeing what they need, interacting with them, getting to know them, trying to figure out how to keep the peace, but also just make sure people get basic services. More and more, there is no officer available to do that walking duty, to be on the floor. And that means there's no one around if somebody needs help. Sometimes that one officer behind the plexiglass is actually watching 4 different housing units at one time. It's too much for one human being to keep track of. There are 30 to 50 people in each one of these housing units. So one officer potentially looking after 200 people with very poor lines of sight sometimes because of the way that Rikers is built. It leads to a lot of situations where people may be in a medical emergency and the officer doesn't even know, or they can't get the attention of somebody when they need help. Over the last several months, since December 2020, 12 people have died here at Rikers. About 5 people have been by death by suicide, it appears. And some of those deaths are directly linked to the lack of staffing, to the fact that officers were not available when people needed help. And it really is a deeply dangerous situation. I mentioned those weapons before. Traditionally, there are search teams that go out through the jails to search for weapons and confiscate them. Those officers are now being pulled into other duties. They're not available to search. And that's even more reason why there are more weapons available. In fact, at this point, everyone feels almost like they need a weapon, even if they have no interest in using one to protect themselves, because there's no officer around to help them if there's a moment of need.
As you're describing the situation, it just sounds untenable and unsafe for everyone there, staff, officers, people who are detained, who are serving time. So I'm wondering, I mean, often this conversation kind of, I think, unfortunately becomes about, decarceration versus public safety. And those are kind of the two polar sides, we talk about solutions and what to do. But I know that from conversations with you, there are so many ways to safely decarcerate, and to think about kind of reimagine public safety and keeping all of New York safe and healthy. So I would love to hear from you kind of how you think about safe pathways to decarceration and into making sure that everyone, officer, staff, people detained, everyone has a safe and healthy environment.
You're absolutely right. The situation at Rikers is unsafe for everyone. Anyone who's in custody, people that come into work at Rikers, officers, civilian staff, people come in to provide programming. No one is safe right now. And the question is, you put it very appropriately, is what do we do? How do we resolve this? And one key issue is obviously we need some of that 30% of officers to actually come to work. Anyone who's physically able needs to be at work because they are needed for sure. The second piece though is that certainly until that happens, but even longer term, we need to have fewer people here because Rikers cannot safely accommodate the folks that are here, cannot take care of them and provide even basic services. Medical care, also getting people to court is a big problem here. If you're not able to go to court and have your case resolved, you're still stuck at Rikers. And so if you can't be brought on a bus and taken to court, you're stuck here for usually another 4 to 6 weeks, if not longer, before your next court appointment. And so one thing we've looked at it as a commission is think about how can we, using safety as our touchstone, how can we reduce the jail population here? Not just about just opening the doors and saying, go home, right? Because there are people that should not say, that cannot at this moment be safely on the streets. And we understand that, and we want to make sure that everyone is safe. Is that what can we do to address that? And I'll just talk about that the court process is one key example. Before the pandemic struck, New York City already took upwards of twice as long to resolve a criminal case as anywhere else in New York State. Right? We were doing a terrible job, frankly, beforehand. Since the pandemic struck, that time has gone up another 70%. So there are about 1,500 people at Rikers who have been waiting for a trial for a year or more. There are over 700 people who've been waiting for 2 years or more for a trial. And they're just sitting here, right? Guilty, innocent, but they deserve their day in court and their case should be resolved. And those people are stuck. And so if we can work with the court system, with attorneys, to be fair, obviously, not to unnecessarily rush in a way that jeopardizes someone's rights, but every day that someone is locked up here is a grave danger to their life, to their threat, to that threat to their life. But it's also doing injustice to victims in cases. There's no accountability just by locking somebody up. When the case is not resolved, we need to figure out, is this the right person? Do we get to arrest the right person? If so, how do we hold them accountable? And if that means sending them to a prison term upstate, that's the decision that's made. Let's get to that point. Let's actually figure out what's an appropriate punishment and accountability measure for somebody. That's not happening now. If we could just get back to the pre-COVID pace of cases, there would be 800 fewer people in Rikers today. If we could improve to just try and catch up, get close to where the rest of the state is, we would have another 500-600 fewer people here. We're talking 1,500 fewer people in jail just by having a reasonable speed of cases. Let's actually resolve whether we have the right person, and if we do, what should be the consequence for their actions. Let's do that, and we can actually greatly reduce the jail population without any threat to public safety.
As we're thinking about this, what does a New York City without Rikers look like? How do you envision a city without Rikers?
Because that really is the long-term solution here. You know, Rikers is irredeemable. The buildings are too far gone, given the fact that it's built on landfill, the isolation, the kind of lawless culture that's bred. The answer is not to rebuild jails here by any stretch. There's no question the jails that exist here have to be torn down. They can't stay for human habitation. They cannot fit for it. But it actually would also be more expensive, significantly more expensive to build jails on Rikers than in the boroughs. You know, the proposal right now is to build 4 jails in the boroughs with a capacity to have, you know, fewer than 4,000 cells, which we have, you know, 5,500 people now. Again, as I said, you reduce the time it takes to get to a resolution of a criminal case, you're already down to about 4,000 people. That's about the population that we're looking at to try and house in the jails, slightly lower than that. We want to push down lower than that if we can safely, obviously. To build jails next to courthouses in the boroughs. You know, the city spends tens of millions of dollars busing people every year to courthouses from Rikers. Oftentimes people get stuck in traffic. They never get to court on time. They miss their court dates, things like that. But also, if you're in the boroughs, people are closer to their families. They're closer to service providers. People have a much better chance to be successful when they get out if they have a proper reentry plan and have access to programs and education and services, and particularly mental health treatment and drug treatment while they're incarcerated. You know, for so many people, the first time they're actually diagnosed with a mental health issue, with a mental illness, and properly treated is at Rikers Island. And that is a real failure of our city, a really failure of our society, frankly, that it shouldn't take incarceration to actually get someone treatment. Again, 17% of the people here have a serious mental health issue, serious mental illness, like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, often completely untreated or even undiagnosed before they got here. That can't be. And so we need to have first of all, community-based treatment that's available so people get treatment before they ever get involved in the criminal system, before there's ever a victim in a case, before people do any harm. Let's actually try and treat people and meet them where they are, keep them at home. And then obviously, if there are situations where someone has committed a crime and we do need to take them somewhere out of the community, let's have a more therapeutic rehabilitative setting. And the goal of those jails in the boroughs is to have significant units dedicated to mental health and drug treatment to ensure that people get care while they're incarcerated. The goal being that somebody should actually be better off, hopefully, when they come out of jail than when they went in. Right now, that is the exact opposite of what happens, unfortunately. But really try and get to a place where jail is a place of have as few people there as possible, keep them there as short a time as possible, but have it be as positive an experience as possible while they are there.
We have a few questions in the chat, and I thank you for putting questions in, and please feel free to keep asking questions in the chat. I'll just ask a few of them right now. How long is the average stay at Rikers today? And if you could just tell us a little bit about the day-to-day life. And you know, I would also love to hear kind of day-to-day life during the pandemic, what that was like for people as well, in terms of programming, college education, things like that.
So the average stay here, the average length of time it takes to resolve a case right now in New York is approaching a year. It was about 340 days or so right now. It was 260 days before the pandemic. So it is already close to a year just to get to the end of your criminal case. That is an extraordinarily long time to be in jail to wait for your day in court. And just really, as I said, New York City does an incredibly poor job on this for a variety of reasons, longstanding reasons. In terms of what day-to-day life is like here, right now, most programming, so the goal of the city is to have at least 5 hours of programming available to everybody in jail, be that educational programming, literacy programs, job training programs, counseling sessions, whatever it is, kind of 5 hours of really intensive programming so people can learn new skills, learn different outlooks, try and find a way forward that's much more positive. Reality is right now that very little of that is being delivered because of the staffing crisis that I talked about, because of the shortage of officers, that without officers to escort the service providers into the jails. And at Rikers, one of the key things, because of it's such a Byzantine layout, frankly, really a maze of hallways and dark corners, that you need an officer to escort almost anyone that's moving through the jails. And so you need an officer to take someone from the front gate into the housing units where people are living to provide services. If there's no officer to take the person there, that person won't arrive and won't provide programming or services. And then if the person arrives there, that escorting officer is not someone who can stay. They have to go escort someone else now. If there's no officer on the floor, as I described earlier, some of these housing units are going days or even hours or days, sometimes even weeks without an officer on the floor. There's nobody there. Then most service providers don't feel comfortable being there alone, because if something, God forbid, goes wrong, there's no one to help. And so most programming options right now aren't happening. And it's something that the administration here is really working, the commissioner is working really hard to try and change, because there's a clear understanding that programming is essential, not just for individual lives, but the reality is that when people are idle in jail, it often leads to frustration, to more interpersonal conflict, and sometimes to violence. And so really trying to ensure that people have positive things to do with their time is essential. Otherwise, people are just sitting in these cinder block cell blocks, often incredibly cold places where everything's metal or cement, with nothing to do all day long. And people would just, there's nothing positive that's happening right now in far too many of the places.
Oh, I want to kind of point out that neither of us has kind of been directly impacted by the system, and of course in our work with the coalition and at Central, we speak with people and raise their voices to talk about directly and lived experiences. But just to kind of I'll share one story of time that I taught on Rikers for a while, just to kind of give a human picture a little bit. But I was teaching a college class with Manhattan College. And I was there for a session right before Thanksgiving, and there was a cooking class happening next to us. And this is what I think about when I think of Rikers. There was a cooking class happening next to us, and when the teacher came in with this kind of really beautiful steaming plate of food, that definitely not something that I had ever seen, on the regular dinner menu there. And I was one-on-one with a student, and he took the plate and he insisted that I share his meal with him. That I told him, I was going home, I was fine, and he wouldn't eat until I ate with him, and that we shared a Thanksgiving meal. So I just, I've experienced that kind of kindness and just the kind of generosity on Rikers that I haven't in so many other places. And, it's just to think about the people who are there and living this story. It's just so horrifying. These are our neighbors and our friends, community members who will come back into the community, who are living through this right now. I want to talk kind of more broadly too. We know that our coalition worked on the Less is More campaign, and Zachary, you were a leader in that, and Governor Hochul signed that into law. Can you tell us kind of what the effect of Less is More will be and has been for the population at Rikers, and more broadly in the state, and how that fits into our conversation today?
Less is More, for those who aren't as familiar, is a parole reform measure that was signed into law almost a month ago by Governor Hochul. And it's a measure that looks at technical parole violations. So people who are accused, who are on parole, so they've been in prison, they were convicted, they served their time in prison, they've now been sent, let out and sent back home to our communities. And they're under a whole host of restrictions as to what they can and can't do on parole. some of the key things are they have curfews. Everybody on parole has a curfew by which they have to be home in the evening, and they can't leave until a certain hour in the morning. That there are restrictions about whom they can spend time with. There are restrictions about where they can go, about how they have to report to their parole officer regularly. They have to be drug tested, things like that. If people violate those rules, any of those rules, under the law before less is more, they can be immediately and automatically incarcerated by their parole officer with the authority of his supervisor. And that means that person is locked up at Rikers until they get a parole hearing to determine whether in fact they did violate parole and what the consequences should be. That generally takes about 2 months to resolve. And during that time, people, if they have a job, will lose their job. People often lose their apartments, or they'll lose their space in a program. If they're in a drug treatment program or even a mental health treatment program, they often lose that slot because they're not coming. If they're in school, they lose their seat in school, and they might forfeit tuition. All these really destructive impacts. And there isn't actually evidence that this type of incarceration for these rule violations, not for new crimes, but for rule violations, actually helps public safety. In fact, in the first 3 years that people are out of prison, 70% are returned behind bars for these technical rule violations in New York State. We are the #1 state in the country for sending people back behind bars for rules violations when they're on parole. And there are lots of states around the country, including very deep red states like Louisiana and Missouri and South Carolina, that have looked at their same systems that were similar and reformed them and said, we can do this better, smarter. We can actually boost opportunity for people. We can give positive incentives and not just use the hammer of incarceration to try and keep people on the straight and narrow, so to speak. And Less is More does that. Less is More borrows kind of the best of the reforms from around the country, including from these law enforcement oriented states, with safety is obviously first and foremost, to say, how can we do this better? How can we try and stop people from going back to jail, but how we actually help people on parole succeed and help cut down on recidivism? And so before Less is More passed and before the pandemic, there were about 700 people, even sometimes higher, on any given day who were locked up at Rikers for these technical parole violations, just waiting for hearings to determine whether in fact they hadn't violated their parole at all. Now, thanks in part because parole did during the pandemic lessen significantly some of their incarceration for these types of things, but also because Governor Hochul signed the bill and parts of the bill went into effect immediately. There are now only about 150 people who are locked up for technical parole violations here. I think that number should be lower, both legally and as a matter of policy, but it's a significant difference. And that is being, you kind of see that all across the state, where people who are being held for these very small, low-level technical violations are being allowed to go home. It's not that they're not without consequences. They can have more severe parole restrictions. They can absolutely be held accountable. They can be ordered into programming and be forced to undergo drug treatment or mental health treatment. There are lots of things parole officers can still do to hold people accountable, but jail is not the answer. Unless there are repeated offenses or more serious violations, then absolutely incarceration is still a possibility. If there's a real threat to public safety, parole officers still have that possibility on the table. It's taking it off the table for things that really are not a threat to anybody. And so that has absolutely helped bring down the population here at Rikers. There are a couple hundred fewer people just since Governor Hochul signed that bill into law a few weeks back, a couple fewer people, 100 people here at Rikers than there were before. And that absolutely is helping the situation. It's a small piece, 200 people out of a population of 5,500. It matters, but it's not certainly as far as we need to go.
We've had a few questions now too about the corrections union. Kind of where are they on the situation at Rikers and their response to this? And also, people are wondering about remote and virtual hearings, court hearings, if those are happening on the island at all. And then lastly, the state of emergency that Governor Hochul kind of said was happening at Rikers Island. Has that had, beyond Less is More, has that had any other impact?
So I'll start with the Governor Hochul pieces, because Governor Hochul did declare a state of emergency. And as part of that, she set up the ability for courts to hold hearings virtually, as some people have talked about, by video, instead of actually having people go to court physically in the boroughs. There's no courtroom, by the way, on Rikers itself. If you have a court case, you're arrested in Manhattan, you go back to Manhattan for your court case to be heard in the courthouse there. Same in all the other boroughs. But under Governor Hope, and the reason the law under New York State is that almost all court appearances have to be all consequential court appearances have to be in person, because people should have the right not only to be seen and heard by the judge, but that also the hearing should be open to the public, that nothing should be hidden here. Given COVID, given the state of emergency at Rikers, we have over the last many months, many hearings have been able to be held virtually because of the threat of COVID. When COVID eased somewhat over the summer, Governor Cuomo ended that emergency authority. The crisis that has now taken hold at Rikers, as Governor Hochul has decided she needs to reinstitute the ability to hold hearings virtually, and she has done that, and that will be a big help. It means that people's cases can move forward much more easily. And one of the key issues here is that escorting I talked about earlier, that in order right now for somebody to be brought to court, it's not a simple process. They're actually woken up about 4:30 in the morning, woken up from their cell. They have to get up, get showered, get dressed. They're then taken down, escorted by an officer, if one is available, to an intake facility, a holding pen area, which is just like a big cell with a bench and a toilet in the corner. Oftentimes 20, 30 people packed in there. Over the past several weeks, some of those facilities have been deeply dangerous and unsanitary, overflowing toilets, feces and urine all over the floor, people not getting fed, people stuck there for days and weeks at a time, no medical care, no showers, no anything. People are brought in there and then have to wait for a bus, which then takes them to a courthouse. So a long, involved process that starts 4:30. You may not get to the courthouse till 10, 11 in the morning. And even then, you may not be seen until 3, 4 in the afternoon. And then you get back to Rikers at 8, 9 at night. So an incredibly exhausting process. The ability to have video hearings where you don't have to take someone off the island, but also that some of the video booths can be in people's housing areas where they don't even need an escort at all. In other words, the officer who's behind plexiglass, who can control the doors remotely, can just open up the door, you walk in, they close it behind you, and there's a monitor and a microphone, and you can talk to the judge and your lawyer, and your case can move. And that will be a huge, very helpful thing. Governor Hochul can do more. She can implement other pieces of less is more immediately. For instance, one key piece is to make sure that judges have the power. If someone else on parole and is accused of a new crime, right now, parole officers control whether or not the person is incarcerated and for how long. And judges don't have a say. And judges really have a much bigger view of the picture of who this person is before them. They know about the criminal case, they know about parole, they know about their history. Parole has some of that, but not all the information. And less is more will say, listen, let a judge decide about whether a person needs to be locked up for a new crime or not. What's safe or not for our community? What's the right thing here? And Governor Hochul can help facilitate that right now by giving judges that power and saying to parole authorities, hold off. Just let's see what happens with the court case. If a person is convicted, if held accountable, we can absolutely add additional penalties for violating parole. But let's actually let the court process move its way forward. That's an example. The question about the unions. There are actually several correctional officers unions. There's the line officers, the regular correctional officers. There's different unions for the captains and for the wardens, deputy wardens, associate deputy wardens, and they're generally on the same page with each other. But the union has. Let's focus on the correction officers union. There are these thousands of officers who are not turning up to work or not available to work on any given day, and the union has actually publicly really backed those officers to the detriment, I believe, of the people who are in the union who are turning up to work every day and are being forced to work double and triple shifts. Because there are absolutely some of those folks who are out are legitimately sick, or they legitimately have a family emergency, and that we should absolutely be understanding and try and work through that with them. But there are a whole host of people that are taking advantage of the system. And it seems to me that the goal of the union should be to ensure to protect their officers that are here at work, that are actually showing up, that are being taken away from their families by being forced to work doubles and triples to try and keep the jail safe and keep them moving forward, and not back all the people that are not turning up to work. And that really is a conflict within the union. The union is saying that nobody is out illegitimately. That just doesn't happen. I wish that were the case, but simply the evidence is otherwise, unfortunately. And so I feel like the union hopefully could be doing more to encourage people to come back to work. They could also be trying to come up with creative solutions about how do we staff this place differently. Um, every officer, as I mentioned, works an 8-hour shift. What if that were a 12-hour shift? And you would work fewer days, more time with your family. It's used in correctional facilities across the country. Not lots of places have tried it. It works well for a lot of people in a lot of family situations. It would cut down on overtime, cut down on how many officers you need on any given day to work. Instead of 3 shifts, you only need 2 shifts. And would really relieve a lot of the doubles and triples that are happening right now. But to date, the union hasn't been open to really exploring that. And so I hope that they become a real partner in this, because this is an opportunity to start to think differently. The jails have not been a safe, hospitable place to work for quite a long time. And right now, they are a deeply dangerous place to work. And so the hope would be the union would come to the table with the city and have a really frank, open discussion with all the, hopefully line officers would be involved in these discussions so we can find a safe way forward for everybody.
I'm wondering too, in addition to union leaders coming in, thinking about kind of public opinion and the way that the situation at Rikers is often portrayed in the media. A lot of times we see in it, we've touched on this, kind of public safety versus decarceration, and these two kinds of polar ends of the conversation. And I'm wondering if you can help us to have a conversation around crime rates, because I think some people think about decarceration and go immediately to a spike in violent crime that has occurred in the city and also around the country. And if you can kind of talk to us a little about safely decarcerating and how that fits with the conversation around violent crime.
I just want to, if I may, just add one more note about the officers who are here, which I think is important, which is that the majority of officers that work at Rikers are Black. Most of the leadership here and huge numbers of officers are women. It is really in many ways kind of reflects and echoes the population of people that are incarcerated. A lot of the people who are officers come from the very same neighborhoods as people who are locked up. And it seems like that may be one reason why this place has been neglected for so long. Race matters, right? And I think we should be cognizant of that and really say the city needs to think very carefully about how it approaches all these issues because of these issues about who people are and what, like this recognizing that we failed for a long, long time. Everybody who's affiliated with Rikers. In terms of crime, bail reform. Let's just think about that for a moment. There have been a lot of stories blaming bail reform for the rise in shootings and violence in the city. And just overall, crime overall has not gone up. What has gone up though is shootings and murders. So obviously the most serious of crimes. And that unquestionably it went up starting last year and has stayed at an elevated rate. It's kind of plateaued relatively, but it is significantly higher than it was a couple of years ago. The issue though is what's to blame for that? And if you look at bail reform, for instance, there was a study done last summer by the New York Post, interestingly enough, looking at New York Police Department data. And they looked at, through the end of June, for instance, they looked at several months. So bail reform kicked in April, in January, and then there were some rollbacks. And then so by June, we kind of had a little bit better picture of what the impact was. There have been 528 shootings in the city. One person, according to NYPD's data and New York Post analysis, who had been released because of bail reform, was accused of being associated with one of those shootings. So 1 out of 528. So obviously can't say that wouldn't have any impact whatsoever, but certainly not the driving force. And I think it's really critical to look at what's happening across the country, because bail reform has taken place in New York, it's taken place in some other cities, but it's not taken place in lots of places. And pretty much every major city, and in fact, many rural areas during COVID have seen a huge increase in the number of shootings and the number of killings. This is not a New York only phenomenon by any stretch of the imagination. It is a national phenomenon. It is driven, it seems, most closely linked to COVID and all the disruptions that has brought, all the stresses it has brought, all the deaths it has brought, all the unemployment, but also the number of weapons, the number of guns that have been bought over the past year and a half has skyrocketed. There are many more guns available than there were even a year or two ago. And all of that, it's an accumulation of things. Services that were kind of giving people other options or other opportunities, whether that's the violence interruption. So for instance, there are programs in New York City where former gang members, people who've been incarcerated, go out into communities and try and diffuse conflicts, try and avoid shootings, try and avoid escalation or repercussions, kind of these revolving cycles of retaliatory shootings to get in there and really try and change trajectories. They weren't able to work during COVID. They weren't able to actually be out on the streets or go knock on people's doors and visit them at home, which they had been doing quite successfully before the pandemic. And that infrastructure just fell away. Meanwhile, people were just cooped up with each other, stressful situations, all these things, all kinds of different things. School wasn't happening properly. We had that phenomenon repeated across the country. Police officers weren't playing as active a role for a variety of reasons in communities, some for their own safety, some as blowback with the George Floyd protests and everything that happened after he was killed. And it just led to this kind of terrible confluence of factors, again, across the country where shootings and killings have gone up. It is not New York City alone, and there is really no evidence that it's bail reform that's driving any of it.
Thanks, Zachary. We have a few more questions too. So I'll just ask a few of them. Where are we with the alternatives to Rikers, the borough-based jails? Are they in construction right now? And then I think as we are kind of pivoting to the conclusion of our conversation, too, people are asking how can we get involved? Do we need to bring more elected officials to Rikers Island? How do we help change the situation and really shine a light on what's going on there?
So the borough jails that are planned to be built, there are 4 jails that will be constructed. There'll be in every borough, one in each borough except for Staten Island. And there are 3 of the boroughs, Brooklyn, Queens, and Manhattan. The jails will be built on the site of existing jails that are right next to the courthouses right now. Jails that unfortunately are they're too far gone to be really habitable. The cells are too small. They're decrepit. They really need to be torn down and rebuilt. But on those footprints, the jails will be rebuilt. In the Bronx, the jail is slated to be built on what's now an NYPD tow pound in the South Bronx. It is not adjacent to the courthouse. That's added to the level of neighborhood opposition and controversy over the site. The old court, it was a jail next to the courthouse, and it was torn down 15 years, 20 years ago and replaced by a shopping mall. And so that site is now not available. This was considered to be the best available site to replace that jail barge that's moored to the Bronx right now. Those facilities are all in stages of being prepared. In other words, like the contracts for demolishing the jails will soon be awarded. In the Bronx, kind of leveling out the tow pound and dealing with the foundational and plumbing and all the issues that need to go underneath the water mains and whatnot. That's about to be issued, the contract. And then the next administration will be the one, whether it's Eric Adams or Curtis Lee or whoever it is, will be issuing the contracts to actually build the new jails. And so there will be this flex point. Eric Adams, for instance, has been an outspoken proponent of closing Rikers and of the borough-based jails, wants as much community input as possible as to the location and the size of the jails. That actually happened under his watch as Brooklyn Borough President, where he helped bring down the size of the proposed jail in Brooklyn and ensure there were better services being provided. That's now the plan moving forward. He wants to make sure that's replicated across the boroughs. But he absolutely believes that the best way forward is to replace Rikers with these 4 borough-based jails. The deadline right now to build those jails is 2027. There's actually a law that was passed earlier this year by the city council that locks in that date. It basically says by August 2027, Rikers can no longer legally be used to incarcerate people. The hope is that Rikers will be used for green infrastructure moving forward, solar panels and composting, all kinds of things that we need environmentally for our city. But that can't happen while there are jails here. But there's that deadline to be met. It's a legal deadline, a hard, fast deadline. And so the borough-based jails are going to be built over the next few years to make sure that we can meet it. In terms of what we can do moving forward, I think critical is raising awareness. The fact that legislative officials have come here, the elected officials have come here, has been essential to raising the profile of what's happening here, the crisis that's happening here, the people that have died here, the really dire conditions here for everybody. I think having more people come and speak out is essential. It is incredibly helpful, and also just to kind of let people know what's happening. There's been a lot of coverage, but coverage doesn't last forever. There'll be other crises that crop up, and the problems doesn't mean the problems are solved. It just means that the spotlight is not here. And so having people that have the power to make the changes that we need, whether that's the mayor, whether that's city council people, state legislators, making sure that you as constituents, they hear from you. To the extent you can, just reach out and say, write or call and say, or email and say, I'm really concerned about the situation at Rikers. What can you do about it? What are you doing about it? How are you helping? Making sure that we have the right staffing in place, people are treated fairly, that's less violent, but that also there are fewer people locked up, that people don't have to be locked into this horrible situation to keep us safe. We know there are better ways forward. Can you please do something about that? I think reminding people that this is an important measure for their constituents goes a long way. As we know from less is more, as we know from all different fights that we've had over the years of all different types, whether it's immigration or otherwise, that people who are elected are responsive to their constituents. And very often constituents don't reach out about things. So actually hearing from people makes a big difference. There are also other things to be done. For instance, a rally next week, try and push to close Rikers as soon as possible to try and bring down the jail population as quickly as possible so that people can be safe, both on the streets and in the jails. And those types of things, we can send around some information about that as well if people want to join that, both virtually or in person.
Zachary, thank you so much for sharing this information and for helping us think more deeply and kind of in a more nuanced way about the crisis at Rikers and what we can do to make our city and our neighbors safer and ensure that everyone is healthy and taken care of. Now, I'm wondering, I've heard you speak so beautifully about this before, and I'm wondering, how your Jewish identity plays a role in your work, and how you think about Jewish texts when it comes to issues of safety and incarceration.
I often think about the phrasing that we're probably all familiar with: tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice, so you pursue. But that actually passage continues, leman tichya, which is so that you may thrive, so that you may live. It's this biblical teaching that it's not just our values that we should pursue justice, but it's deeply intertwined with our well-being. And I think that is really being lived out here at Rikers, that we have the situation which is dire. We have people whose lives are threatened, both people who work here and people who are incarcerated here. But it's not something that's just on the isolated island of Rikers. Most people, as Rabbi was saying, they get out, right? They come back to our communities. Officers are coming back to our community every day. And whether that's the threat of COVID that's here or the stress of violence and what it means both physically and mentally to be in this environment all the time is deeply impactful for people and traumatic for people. And we need to find a way where people are treated justly, because it's not only in the interest of them as human beings, but it's in all of our interest that people who are coming back to our community are in a better place than when they came into Rikers, and not the often much worse off place than they were when they went in. The chance of people committing further crimes, hurting themselves or hurting other people, goes up significantly if they're subjected to trauma like people are experiencing right now at Rikers. And that has to change. It's in everyone's best interest. And so, I think about that. I think there's passages about not over punishing people and recognizing that these are people that are pre-trial, haven't actually been convicted. Nobody, even if they were convicted, should be subjected to these conditions, but really being conscious of what we are subjecting human beings to. And there's a passage that talks about that if you give someone more than 40 lashes, that you should not do that lest your brother be debased before your eyes. And it's interesting because there are multiple interpretations of who that brother is. There's the brother who's being whipped and beaten down and degraded, but there's also the brother who's doing the whipping. And the fact that if we choose to subject people to this over punishment and these vicious conditions, what does that mean for all of us? And it also, though the passage also uses the word brother, right? It is that no matter what, the person who is being punished is still one of us, still part of our community. And it helps remind me to keep things front and center, even when people are accused of doing some terrible things. they're still part of us. And we need to find a way to work together for the best way forward for everybody.
Amen. I'll just add to that, because we're in Parshat Noach this week. There's a beautiful midrash that comes out of this parsha as well, and I think it really pertains to questions of justice. It's that when the people are building the tower in the city of Babel, we're told that God comes down to the city and to the tower to see what's going on. And the Midrash Tanhuma reads that as God coming to see for God's self what's happening. And this should be a teaching for judges, that when judges are rendering a verdict, before they're allowed to render a verdict or to mete out a punishment, they have to see for themselves. They have to understand the nuances of the case. They have to understand context before they can do any of that. And I see that for us as this obligation to get proximate, to see what's going on, as Brian Stevenson says, to get proximate, to see what's going on, to understand exactly what's happening in our cities and our backyards, and to make sure that we have an understanding of context and that we are paying attention to individuals and caring for them, just as God does and just as God demonstrates in our text. So this kind of look at our criminal justice system and the people who are there is I believe, a divine obligation for us, and something in ways that we can imitate God and be godlike, to pay this kind of attention and care to the most vulnerable, to our brothers and sisters who are on Rikers Island and who are on the inside in our state and country. So, Zachary, thank you so much for taking the time, for doing this, for sharing your insight and your incredible knowledge. You'll receive emails from the coalition about how to get more involved. We'll send out information about that rally that Zachary mentioned, and please also contact your elected officials and let them know that you care, that you're paying attention, and that you want things to change on Rikers. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, everybody, for joining. Really appreciate your time. And just one last plug would be to also get in touch with the governor specifically and ask her to implement less is more as soon as possible, fully. It really will make a difference, both in terms of safety, in terms of incentives for people on parole, positive incentives, and also just helping with the situation at Rikers. So it's the right thing to do all around. And I'm grateful again for everybody taking the time to listen and to ask those great questions in the chat. And thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Zachary.